There have been many civil wars in the history of the world. The American Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, and the Chinese Civil War. But the Civil War I'm going to talk about is the English Civil War. It all started during the reign of King Charles I. Charles's reign got off to a bad start. He married Henrietta Maria, the sister of the King of France. She was Catholic, and Parliament was alarmed that she might make her children Catholic as well. Charles wanted to demonstrate his power. He went to war with Austria, Spain and France. All of these military expeditions were disasters, which nearly bankrupted the country. Charles also quarrelled with Parliament about money and dissolved Parliament for many different reasons, until in 1629 Charles dissolved Parliament completely and ruled without Parliament for 11 years. When Charles had tried to rule without Parliament, he had taken great powers for himself, but in the end he had failed because he had lacked money and the confidence of his people. Now the MPs began to take away some of his powers. They refused to grant him taxes until he agreed to their demands. The first demand was to get rid of the much hated Earl of Stratford. He was tried for treason and executed in 1641. The Archbishop Laud was imprisoned. The other demands were also met. In a short time, the MPs had abolished the ship money tax and the Star Chamber, a court that had been used to punish the king's enemies. At this moment, in October 1641, there came news of a terrible massacre in Ireland. The king began to assemble an army, but Parliament led by the Puritan John Pym was alarmed. The MPs feared Charles would use the army to attack anyone who had opposed him back in England. Pym demanded that Parliament should decide who should lead the army. Charles now wanted to show Parliament that he ruled the country, not them. He decided to go to the House of Commons and arrest Pym and 4 rebels MPs for high treason. On the 4th of January 1642, the king went to Westminster with 400 soldiers. Just before he arrived, the 5 hunted MPs escaped by boat down the River Thames. Charles marched in and saw he was too late. "All the birds have flown," he said to the Speaker. Many people were shocked at the king's actions. By law, MPs could not be arrested when they were in the House of Commons. Riots broke out in London. A week later, Charles and his family had fled the city. On the 22nd of August 1642, Charles moved south from York to Nottingham. His army was growing, and his nephew Prince Rupert had arrived from Holland to lead his cavalry. But Parliament controlled the main ports, the Navy and the City of London. The king realised that leaving London had been another mistake. He sent off for the capital with an army of 13,000 men. Parliamentary, led by Puritan Earl of Essex, had already left London to cut him off. The two forces met at Edge Hill near Warwick. Neither side won that day, and the king didn't go towards London but retreated to Oxford, because London was well defended. Early in 1643 the king set up camp and headquarters in Oxford. For a while everything went well. Henrietta Maria returned from Holland to join him. Royalists in West Country captured Bristol. In September the king signed a truce with the Irish Catholics. This brought more troops back to England for his cause. But John Pym, the parliamentary leader, was working hard to increase his forces. He gained the help of Scots, who promised to fight the king if Parliament would allow a Presbyterian church into England. Once again, Charles had made a big mistake. Although he had won several battles, he had not advanced on London. He failed to capture the city of Gloucester because he hesitated. Then in September he withdrew from a battle of Newbury. In January 1644 the Scots came south with 21,000 men and stormed Newcastle. It was too late for Charles to win. The Scottish army, fighting on the Parliament side, changed the war in the north. 3 parliamentary armies besieged York. When Prince Rupert tried to save York for the king, his army was beaten at the Battle of Maston Moor. After this battle, Cromwell was seen as one of Parliamentary's most important generals. He made sure his men were well trained and organised. York fell to Parliament a few weeks later. King Charles had lost northern England. In the south, Parliament had problems. In September, the Earl of Essex had surrendered to a royalist army in Cornwall. In winter 1644-45, Parliament agreed to set up a new army. All the old local armies were broken up, and all MPs and lords gave up their military commands. The new model army was made up of 22,000 full-time paid and trained men. Its commander, Sir Thomas Fairfax, asked Cromwell to be in charge of the cavalry. The new model army met the King's forces at Naseby on the 14th of June 1645. Though Rupert's cavalry had more success, the Royalists were beaten. Charles retreated to the Welsh border. By May 1646 the King was under siege at Oxford. He escaped from the city disguised in a false beard and dark clothes. The Civil War really ended in June 1646 when the Royalists at Oxford surrendered. The King had given himself up to the Scots and was trying to get them to side with him. Yet his opponents were still arguing with each other about whether or not to increase taxes. Only Cromwell kept the army and Parliament together. Charles would not agree to the demands of the Scots, so in February 1647 they handed him over to the English. He was pleased to see that there was splits between Parliament and the army was growing wider. Parliament had ordered the army to disband without paying the soldiers. Cromwell and Fairfax acted quickly. In June they had the King taken to Newmarket, where he would be in the army's power. Cromwell offered Charles a deal, called the heads of the proposals. Parliament would control the army for 10 years, and then the King would take command. This was a generous offer, but once again Charles refused. He tried to get help from the Scots a second time, but in November, before the Scots responded, he escaped from the house arrest. Soon, a second civil war started. In 1648, Royalist risings began in Wales and the south. A Scottish army crossed the border, this time on the King's side, but one by one Cromwell and Fairfax crushed them, finally defeating the Scots at the Battle of Preston. The King was recaptured and taken to Windsor. The army's leaders now realised that they could not trust him. They declared that Charles must be brought on to public trial for all his wrongdoings, but most MPs would not allow such a trial. It seemed wrong to do this to a monarch, so for the first time the army turned against Parliament. On the 6th of December 1648, Colonel Thomas Pride surrounded the House of Commons with soldiers. All MPs were stopped before going in, except those who wanted a trial. The much smaller Parliament appointed a High Court of 135 people. The trial began on the 20th of January 1649. A week later, Charles was sentenced to death. On the 30th of January 1649, Charles was beheaded outside the banqueting hall at the Palace of Whitehall. His armies fled abroad, and Parliament had got what they wanted. England was declared a republic in 1653. Oliver Cromwell closed Parliament and created his own Parliament himself, made up of 140 religious Puritans, and they ruled until 1657, when Oliver Cromwell died. 3 years later, King Charles's eldest son, Charles, Prince of Wales, was crowned King of England, but in England never to be the same again. Just like all other civil wars in the world, the two sides reflected the attitudes towards life. The effects of the Civil War can be seen all across Britain, not just in traditions, but in ordinary people's tastes, interests, beliefs and choices. To be a Cavalier, you are flamboyant, you have no interest in organising things, you like to show off, you're very stylish, you like exposure, and believe that you decide when you've had enough of things, such as alcohol or spending money. You like things as they are, and you very much oppose change. To be a Roundhead, you are careful about what you do. You're organised, thoughtful, militant, plain and simple. You are very politically correct and believe in equal society. You believe in censorship and like the freedom of criticism, such as criticising TV shows, films and people who you know. Today, the divide between Cavalier and Roundhead is more extreme than in the past, and all prejudice against each other have become more extreme as well. It's seen in almost all walks of life all across Britain. The English Civil War was one of 7 civil wars England had, but the key to the reason why the English Civil War is the most famous out of them all is because of its impact and the way it shapes Britain today.